4 months into a war, it was losing everywhere. A beaten fleet did the one thing its beaten enemy had never once prepared for. It reached out across the whole dark and touched the machine's untouchable heart. The blow did almost no damage. It changed the course of the entire war because it proved a thing the Imperium had staked everything on being false. The enemy was not beaten. The enemy had barely started. The idea was almost insulting in its smallness. The whole weight of the war sat on the wrong side of the ledger. Every fleet beaten or hiding, and a room full of tired Union planners answered it with a plan to send a handful of ships an impossible distance to scratch the one world the enemy believed could never be scratched. It would not win anything. That was never the point of it. Vharen Prime was the heart of the machine, the world that built the swarms, and in 4 months of war, no human ship had come within 100 light-years of it. The Imperium had told its people and itself that the homeworld was simply beyond reach, a fact as settled as gravity. A whole empire's certainty rested quietly on that one belief. No one had ever thought to test what would happen if it broke. The distance alone should have made it impossible. Vharen Prime sat deeper in enemy space than any Union ship had ever gone and lived, a crossing so long that half the plan was simply arithmetic, fuel and time, and the exact bending course that would thread a strike force through 100 patrol zones without ever being seen. On paper, it barely closed. In the room, no one said the obvious thing, which was that the paper was generous. They asked for volunteers and were blunt about the odds, which were bad. The ships that went would go light and fast and mostly alone, too far out to be supported, too deep in to be recovered if it went wrong. More crews stepped forward than there were berths. A beaten fleet, it turned out, was full of people who had been waiting a long time for someone to finally ask them to hit back. Lieutenant Ione Vance took her element out with them, because by now everyone understood that the raid lived or died on one thing, and that one thing was her particular gift. To get in and out of the most defended place in the war, the strike force could not fight as a crowd. It had to fight as a single hand. There was exactly one officer in the fleet who had already proven she could make ships do that. So they sent her. They went out at the dark of a moon with no ceremony, because ceremony draws eyes. A lean strike force, fast ships and drone tenders stripped of everything they did not need, slipping one by one into the deep on a course that pointed at the last place in the war anyone would think to look for them. Behind them, the beaten fleets held their breath. Ahead lay 10,000 light-years of enemy dark. The crossing was the worst part, and the longest. Weeks in the deep dark on a course plotted through the wide gaps between patrols, engines throttled down, every emission killed, a handful of ships threading the seams of the enemy's own space while the vast red war ground on somewhere behind them. They never risked getting close and never had to. To sensors tuned to hunt for fleets, a few cold, silent, scattered specks read as nothing at all, and nothing was exactly what the machines kept looking past. Twice the crossing nearly ended before it began. A Vharen battle group's sweep bent toward their track, and the raiders went utterly dead in the black, engines cold, every emission killed, and let its sensors comb the dark and move on. To a machine hunting for an armada, a handful of cold, scattered contacts at the far edge of the noise were beneath its notice, not worth the power to resolve. A force that thought only in fleets had no attention to spare for shapes pretending to be nothing at all. They came through the outer approaches of Prime by simply being beneath notice, cold and quiet and few. Under the threshold, a system built to stop fleets was ever tuned to flag. The great orbital fortresses swept the dark for armadas and logged nothing worth a response because a handful of cold ships was nothing an armada hunting sensor was built to see. The most defended world in the war lay open in front of them. Then over the heart of the machine, they struck. It was not a battle, it was a handful of ships doing precise violence to things that had never once been threatened. Tender yards and swarm cradles and the vast orbital foundries where the killers were born, all of it wide open, none of it defended against a threat that was not supposed to be able to exist. For a few minutes, the little strike force worked in the enemy's holiest dark, and it burned. They hit the swarm cradles first, the immense orbital foundries where the Vharen grew their killers by the thousand, and watched a century of the enemy's certainty come apart in silent fire. It was a scratch against the true size of the machine, and everyone flying it knew that. But it was a scratch on the one place the machine had sworn no scratch could ever land, and that made it something the size of the whole war. Cradle after cradle went up as they worked down the line, the vast orbital wombs where the swarms were grown split open to the void, with their half-finished killers spilling out cold and dead. Nothing shot back. Nothing had ever needed to. The raiders moved through the enemy's holiest industry, doing calm and total damage. A handful of small ships loose in a place built entirely on the certainty that they could never be there. When the homeworld's defenses finally woke, they woke huge and furious and far too late. Orbital fortresses that had never once fired in anger lit the dark with fire aimed at an enemy already scattering. Swarms boiled up from every ring at once, with nothing yet to chase. The largest concentration of firepower in the war came fully awake and found the thing that had woken it already dissolving into the black on a dozen separate headings. By the time the homeworld's defenses understood that the impossible was happening, the impossible was mostly over. Swarms scrambled from every fortress at once, a fury with nothing to close on, because the raiders were already burning for the dark on the far side of the world, scattered and running, using the enemy's own vast confusion as cover. The machine had built its whole defense to stop a fleet. It had never been asked to catch a handful of ships that simply refused to be a fleet. The run for home was a running fight, and here the thing they had come to proved itself again. The strike force did not scatter into easy prey. It ran as one, each ship covering the next through the closing swarms exactly as a squadron had covered a convoy at the Tallow Deep, one will and one hand threading a needle no crowd could have threaded. They had come the whole impossible way to make a point, and the getting home was half of it. The plan for getting out was not to fight the reaction, but to become impossible to aim at. The strike force broke into pieces the instant the work was done, each ship and each small group running its own cold course into the dark, so that a defense built to crush one target had a dozen to chase and could commit fully to none. It was the same idea that had held a corridor at the deep, turned inside out. Refused to be the thing the machine was built to kill. It came at a hard price, the way it always would. Ships that had crossed half the war to strike the homeworld did not all cross back. Some fell in the running fight, some, too damaged to make the distance, turned to buy the others time and were lost in the enemy's backyard with no one to mark where. The raid asked a hard price of the people who flew it. They had known that going in and gone anyway. One tender took a hit that killed her speed, and her captain did the arithmetic in a heartbeat and turned back into the pursuit so the rest could run. She fought alone in the enemy's own sky until there was nothing left of her to fight, and she was not the only one. The homeworld was a long way from home. Some of the people who reached it stayed there, in the dark, so the news of what they had done could reach everyone else. Ione brought most of her element out through the closing dark, the way she had brought a squadron out of the deep, last and covering. It cost her ships and it cost her people, and she carried the weight of both out with her along with the raiders she saved. She had done the impossible thing they sent her to do. She had also learned, again, the exact price of it, and filed it with the rest. Measured the way the Imperium measured things, the raid was almost nothing. A few foundries that would be rebuilt in a season. A dent in a war machine so vast, the dent barely showed. On the Vharen charts, the Ember raid was a rounding error, an insult. A thing to be repaired and forgotten. The machine read the damage exactly and read the meaning of it not at all. It had never had an instrument for meaning, but the meaning was the whole of it. For 4 months, the Imperium had told every world it took that resistance was pointless, and the machine was beyond reach. Now, over the homeworld itself, the enemy had reached. The lie was broken in the one place a lie like that cannot survive being broken. Every beaten fleet in the calm heard the news the same way, as a single sharp breath drawn in after a long time holding it. The machine could be touched. Everything followed from that. The news went out faster than any ship, and it landed on the beaten fleets like the first hard breath after a blow. On 100 wardroom screens, the same impossible words. The homeworld had been struck. Not a fortress, not a border, the homeworld itself, the place the enemy swore no one could reach. Tired crews who had spent 4 months learning only how to lose read it twice, and then a third time, and felt something they had almost forgotten how to feel. And the Imperium, for the first time in the war, was not thinking clearly. A machine feels no shame, but the people who command the machine do, and the raid on the homeworld was a wound to something older and stupider than strategy. It could not be allowed to stand. The enemy that had done it had to be found and destroyed at once, wherever it hid, whatever the cost. Certainty had become the crack, and now pride widened it. So the machine did the thing the raiders could not have dared to plan for. It took the bait it did not know was bait. To draw out and finish the enemy's last real strength, the Imperium committed its main fleet to a single decisive stroke at the quiet waypoint its planners had already marked. A place called Kestrel, and it went in certain and angry, and for the first time in the war, not quite looking where it stepped. And so the greatest fleet the war had yet assembled began to move, not with the cold patience that had won it every battle, but with something new and human and fatal running underneath. Haste. It gathered its strength, aimed itself at a single point, and drove for Kestrel to end a war it still believed it had already won. Certain of everything except the one thing that would matter, which was whether it was still looking as carefully as it used to. This was the hinge of the whole war, though almost no one alive that day could have named it. The long retreat was over, not because the machines had stopped winning, but because they had finally been made to want something, and wanting is the beginning of every mistake. A beaten people had struck the unstrikable and lived. An unbeatable enemy had been stung into overreach. The tide had reached its full and turned in the dark without a sound. Ione came home from the homeworld a different officer than the lieutenant who had held one gap at the Reach a lifetime and 4 months ago. She had proven her method at a squadron, then at a fleet's whole survival, then over the enemy's own heart. She still carried an unopened letter and an old scarred drone and more grief than she talked about. But she carried something new now too. The war had a shape she could see and a place in it that was hers. Ahead lay Kestrel, and everything the war had been building toward since the first machines fell on Halcyon in the golden dark. The enemy was coming certain and angry and blind in exactly the way the whole long retreat had taught one side to punish. A fleet was learning at last to fight as a single hand, and a rising lieutenant with a proven idea was on course for the battle that would finally let her prove it where the whole war could see. Across the dark, on the far side of the coming battle, a different fleet was gathering, smaller and hungrier, and carrying a lesson 4 hard months in the learning. It did not have the numbers, it did not need them, if the thing Halvard taught and Ione proved was true. For the first time since Halcyon, a Union fleet was bound for a battle it had chosen, with a way to win it and the will to try. The first strike had opened the war in a single golden dawn, and everything since had been the long dark falling. But the dark had a bottom, and the fleet had found it, and begun, ship by ship and lesson by hard lesson, to climb. The tide that gave the war its name had come all the way in, and started at last to go back out. What it would carry with it when it went, no one yet knew. But the turning had begun, and it had begun in the dark, with a spark,